Hey, everybody, welcome to the show. We have with us a guest this week, Dr. Justin Hecht, a Jungian analyst practicing out of San Francisco. Hi, Dr. Hecht. Thank you for joining us.
Hello, Mark. Thank you for having me on your podcast.
So, the reason I wanted to do this is because, well, I think I told you in the email, I think a lot of people could benefit from Jung and depth psychology, but the problem is they're almost never exposed to these ideas. And when they are exposed to these ideas, it's usually in the context of, oh, Jung, yeah, that's that crazy guy who was stacking rocks, when he was going through his whatever mental break when he was 42 and drawing strange pictures. And it's not scientific. It's not
hmm
scientific. We have evidence based practices now. So I
hmm
thought it would be good to reach out to a Jungian analyst and talk with him about, well, I think most importantly, how you came to Jung and how those ideas really do apply in our present day situation.
Sure. Well, I'm glad for the opportunity to answer some questions and perhaps clear up some misconceptions. And I think what I'd like to do is to start with my different psychotherapeutic theoretical influences. And I started being taught cognitive behavioral therapies, which I
Mhm.
found to be very, very effective, both in my own life and in the work with my clients. I found that when people would use the work of David Burns and his books like Feeling Good, as well as the work that came out of Martin Seligman and Aaron Beck, all of these theories that I believe correctly identified the ways in which dysfunctional thoughts could mediate our responses to the environment. I found those to be very helpful, and I continue to use cognitive approaches to this day. The the way I got interested in Jung started when I was studying at Columbia and taking a course on advanced psychotherapy taught by Professor Barry Farber. And he said that one of the problems with the way psychotherapy was taught, at least at this point, this was the late 1980s, early 1990s, was that most people presented for psychotherapy with problems that weren't really covered by the DSM categories, and where there really weren't uh, treatment modalities that were available to address the presenting problems. He said that so many people came in with feelings of incompleteness, feelings of a lack of purpose, feelings of confusion, feelings of a kind of ennui, or what the French call angoisse, a sort of a sense that something was missing in their life. And as you know, there's no DSM 4 category for something just feels missing in my life.
Yeah.
And I saw a lot of those kinds of people. And so that kind of primed me to begin looking. And that was around 1989, 1990.
Like maybe there's something else here besides maybe yeah, something else besides, yeah, let's just change these negative thoughts.
Exactly, exactly. And
Right.
and I never want to I really don't want to put down that work. I think it's very helpful. I think dysfunctional thoughts do make people more miserable. So there's always a value in helping to
Yeah.
create less misery.
Yeah,
But
just for the record, for the
sure.
record, this isn't about disabusing CBT. I think that is helpful also in a certain
Mhm.
context, though, and I think you're about to talk about that context.
Exactly. So I kept wondering about this. How do we talk about questions of meaning and what is the purpose of life and why do people have these feelings of disaffection, of disconnection, of alienation? How do we address that? And so I began exploring, and I felt that the interpersonal theories of Carl Rogers were very, very helpful with the idea that you provided a warm container, helpfulness, reflection. That helped people. I'm a great believer in group therapy, and so the work of Irv Yalom and other group therapists has formed an important part of my practice. But
Mhm.
when I really began learning about Jung, I believe that he brought a number of key critical insights to the work of psychoanalysis. And so, what happened for me was that as I began reading Jung on the development of personality and began to understand his own background, what I discovered was that Jung was a man whose father was a pastor in the Swiss Lutheran Church who had lost his faith. Jung was a very bright boy and discovered early in his life, he was 10 or 11 or 12, he began having dreams that indicated to him that his father was basically faking it. And so, in many ways, I understand his life as an attempt to understand what was the religious impulse in people, how do people find meaning and purpose in their lives, and how could a psychotherapy address it? And I was lucky to have a number of books and teachers and experiences that really helped to reinforce that therapeutic and theoretical way of addressing the problems. Happy to talk about a few of those.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there, as we say in the podcast world.
Sure.
The relationship between psychology and religion. You mentioned group therapy, which is good. I have that on my notes. I want to talk about that because I think group therapy is really important. Oh, geez. Okay, but specifically, what are the things that Jung to you brought up that were crucial for psychotherapy? You said something about that he addressed certain problems. What were
Sure.
those exactly?
Well, I think the most important is the role of the unconscious in psychic life.
Right.
So when I studied, I encountered a lot of orthodox Freudian psychoanalysts. I'm thinking in particular of Bernie Cohen, who was one of my supervisors in Boston, and he was remarkably brilliant and very kind, and he really had a huge influence on me and wanted me to apply to the Boston Psychoanalytic. And I really liked what he was doing, but we kind of got in an argument about the nature of the unconscious. And he felt that the unconscious was all about aggression, sexuality, a death wish, unacceptable, socially frowned upon impulses and drives that could never be integrated. And I'd been
Hmm.
reading Jung at that point, and Jung's position was that all of that was true, and the unconscious had more positive aspects, and that those more positive aspects included creativity, a sense of making meaning, a desire to connect with other people, religious and spiritual expression and connection, and finally, this concept that Jung calls individuation. So, Jung's idea around individuation is this idea that each of us has a unique destiny and destiny to fulfill and a unique role to play in the world, and that we become unhappy when we're out of touch with our individuation journey. And to me, when I heard that, that made so much sense that I said, I really want to continue studying that. And that's the kind of therapist I'd like to be. And so I began
Right.
studying it more and more.
Yeah, okay. So to take it back to the somebody who comes in the clinic and let's say they have negative thoughts,
Hmm.
getting them to change the negative thoughts, that can be helpful. But if they also have, as you were talking about, maybe maladaptive relationships, especially with their family or mother or
Hmm.
father, or if they don't have any meaningful purpose in their life, yeah, they're not on the process of becoming individuated,
Hmm.
then changing the negative thought, that seems like more of a symptom than anything else. You're just adjusting the symptom and not attacking the root issue, which is us and how we relate with our unconscious.
I think that's really true. And I see the improvement of the negative and distorted cognitions as one of the ways that you build an alliance that allows you to work on correcting and improving relationships, including the relationship between the client and the therapist. And then at some point throughout the therapy, to really begin creating a space where you allow people to reconnect with their dreams, their wishes, and their hopes for the kind of life they'd like to live. Now, of course, just
Yeah.
because we connect with those dreams, wishes, and hopes, there's no guarantee that they will eventuate into a reality we get to live. But at least knowing that we desire more than we're having helps us to identify the problems and concerns, and we can begin to strive towards making a more meaningful life for ourselves.
Yeah, that's a great point. The way I describe it is the relationship between the client and the therapist, or this will probably dovetail into group therapy, but the client and other clients and the therapist, that's the incubation chamber
Hmm.
for other relationships. Like, hey, look, you can come to this one place, whether it's individual therapy or group therapy, and you're honest, you're open, you can connect. This is a model for how your relationship with, let's say, your estranged father is going to be.
I think that's a wonderful point. I think that's really what we're trying to do.
Yeah. And then once you get that relationship rekindled, and he may have his own issues and he may not be willing to connect, but just you reaching out to make that connection is going to have a huge impact. And then from that position, changing the negative thought, it's going to, be a lot easier.
Mm-hmm.
You're like, oh yeah,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, what it is in a sense is getting your willpower back. You're getting to this regulated place where you have your willpower again. You're like, oh, maybe I can choose the thoughts that I want to have.
I think that's true, and I think that a good and warm and safe therapeutic relationship between client and therapist is something that can really help develop the willpower and encourage and empower the client.
Yeah. Okay, good. Was there anything else about Jung that you wanted to talk about? Anything else specifically, like the archetypes, for instance? Have you
Sure.
found those useful in your practice?
Absolutely. So one big influence on me has been Jean Bolin, and she's written a whole number of books about this, Jean Shinoda Bolin. And a good place to start with understanding Jungian archetypes is reading some of her books. And two I would recommend are Goddesses in Every Woman and Gods in Every Man. And this goes back to the Greek gods, and she believed that the Greek gods expressed different aspects of our personality. So you might have a woman who'd be more of a Hera. Hera is the goddess of mothering and hearth and home. You might have a woman who's more of the god of love is Aphrodite, or more of an Artemis, the hunter, and that there are different aspects of women who are expressed through the different aspects of the Greek goddesses. Similarly, there are gods in every man. So you might have a man who's more of a Hermes, a messenger god who's able to understand different levels of consciousness, a man who's more of an Apollo, straight sighted and very rational, a man who's more of a Dionysus, more passionate, or some combination of all of them. The idea of an archetype is that it is something that is a typical picture of a particular energy that is manifest. And I've found that understanding that archetypes exist in all of our lives, as well as in popular culture, does a number of things for a client in therapy. Number one, it helps someone feel less alone. If you can feel that you're not the only person in the world who's had a heartbreak and begin to understand how much of a theme that's been archetypally throughout literature,
Yeah,
whether
for
it's
thousands
connected.
of years even, right? Like, oh,
Exactly.
this is what they were dealing with. Yeah, I mean, even go back into the Iliad and the Odyssey.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
for younger people, the Iliad can help a little bit more because that's much more heroic. And then for people in midlife, the Odyssey can help more because that's about a man in the middle of his life at the peak of his powers who keeps getting frustrated by forces beyond his conscious control.
Hmm.
And we see these themes coming up again and again and again. So, back in Celtic religion, there's Tristan and Isolde, which then comes through an opera, which is recast as Romeo and Juliet, and then shows up in the movie Titanic, where there is a love that's just too perfect to exist in the world. And I think men and women really benefit from being able to understand these mythic truths, these archetypes as being things that they want to express. So number one is that feeling of a lack of loneliness. Number two is a feeling of a certain dignity in your life, that you're living out these ancient patterns. And number three is there's a kind of prediction and perspective that happens when you begin to understand that while you're living a certain mythical power, you're living a kind of an archetype, you also need to keep it in perspective and contain it. So in all those ways, I find archetypes useful.
Yeah, this is what everybody else has been dealing with for such a long time, and I think in part that's why group is helpful, is because you go and you hear other people talk about their issues, and in a way you
Exactly.
think, whoa, this is exactly what I'm going through. I mean, emotionally. The particulars may be different, the experience may be different, but emotionally, we're going through the exact same thing. And
I,
and
I
this exact same thing that Philoctetes went through, you know,
yes.
in the Iliad. And that provides a lesson for how to get out of it, or at least some kind of the form for how to get out of it.
I think that's really correct. And also the idea that there are a lot of inauthentic encounters in any culture. I think that the social media, the internet, a lot of these new technologies, a lot of these tools get misused to degrade the qualities of our encounters and connections. And group therapy feels to me like an antidote. I want to briefly mention that I'm a little bit unusual as a Jungian analyst who believes in group therapy as a modality. Jung was so much about individuation, so much about helping people find their own path, that he believed that a group could be destructive because it would enforce conformity. I don't agree with him in that. I think that a group can be a way that people can give each other courage for the journey and help each other hold visions for how they can go forward and lead a more fulfilling and meaningful life.
Yeah, I never really understood that because, I mean, individuation isn't just about becoming your own self. I mean, that's part of it, at least how I understand it. Correct me if I'm wrong. It's becoming your own self in the context of being a human. So, yeah, realizing how unique you are, sure, but also at the same time, how much like everybody else you are.
I like that interpretation of it. I'm not sure Jung would entirely agree. Jung,
Yeah.
this is one of the reasons why
I have an
he's
issue
a
with projection on that, so I hero worship Jung, so that's my issue, but I'm sorry, continue.
No, no, that's okay. I think Jung's a hard person to really know well. I was lucky enough to know a couple of people who knew him, and he could be very humorous and very kind to people who knew him, but he really didn't care a lot about what anyone else thought of him. He was in many ways a self-contained genius, and you mentioned his building rocks and building a castle and playing alone on the shores of Lake Zurich after his
Mhm.
break with Freud. And that was kind of characteristic. So he really did feel that for him, at least, as a very introverted thinking type, he needed a lot of time away from people. And that was kind of the model that he put forward as a way to lead a good life. And I'm an extroverted feeling type. So I've had to deal with understanding how different I am from Jung himself and how I can adapt his ideas to the sort of life I want to lead.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. And also he seemed, or he at least tacitly approved of 12 step. I think especially, I forget the seventh or eighth step, which involves making amends, reaching out to people you may have hurt, which I think goes back to what we were talking about of creating better connections with people.
Yes,
So,
there's quite a story there that I'm not an expert on, so I don't want to claim that this is completely correct, but I believe he met with Roland someone who was an early founder of 12 Step, who then went on to work with Bill W. to help work with the to help found the 12 Step movement. And I forget exactly the
mhm.
details of the story, but Jung essentially said that. You will not be able to stop drinking until you stop looking for the spirit in the bottle and begin looking for the spirit of life. Jung said that what made a life meaningful was to be connected to something larger than yourself. And for him, it had to do with a certain conception of religion, but he wanted clients who went through Jungian analysis to be connected with things bigger than themselves. And it could be ideals of living, it could be a cause that's bigger than yourself. So, in many ways, his spirit does inspire at least some of the aspects of AA and the 12 step movements.
Yeah. Um, I take that to being spirit as connection in
Yes,
general. Okay, so
yes,
you mentioned religion earlier, or how we may have created the Greek gods from archetypes of our own psyche. We project them out. The way we talk about ourselves is we create these stories about
yes.
these gods and talk about it that way. We project it out. Do you think, well, maybe this is a loaded question. I don't know.
Mhm.
Well, what are your thoughts on religion and Jungian psychology? And when people come into the clinic, are they ultimately seeking a religious experience, even if they don't know it?
Oh boy, that is a
Sorry, was
quite
that
a
too much?
complicated. No, no, that's fine. I'll take the last part. Are people seeking a religious experience even if they don't know it? And I would say it depends on your definition of religion. And I will say yes, the way that I define religion. So religion comes from the Latin ligio, which is like ligature or to link, and re ligio is to link back. So I think people are coming frequently to a clinic or to a private psychotherapy office like mine, looking for some way to connect themselves back with something that they have lost. I do believe that's something that's happening, and so in that sense, they're looking to be connected with something of themselves that they've lost. And I think Jung's great insight is that religion is not necessarily literally true, but the psychological power that motivates people to invest in religion, that psychological power needs to be understood and respected. And if people are not religious, they need to try to understand how to deal with the religious impulses and desires and drives that they have.
Right, and if they don't, it may come out in very strange ways. Like you
Exactly.
mentioned, tyranny, right? Like
Exactly.
you're going to try to turn the state into religion and
Th-
sacrifice there, and then yeah, he talked about that in that really small book that he wrote towards the end of his life. I always botch the name. It's not the Discovery of the Unconscious, but
Yeah, I'm
boy,
not sure. That book's not occurring to me right now, but I think I know. He wrote so much, so many volumes, but I think that's true. He saw state tyranny as the great problem of conformity. That's why he was so suspicious of groups. I think if he were alive in 2020 or 2019, he would see technology and consumerism as great problems of areas where we have displaced our religious faith and our need for meaning. So many people will displace impulses that might previously have gone into religion. They will displace those onto other areas, such as consumerism, social media, um, computer games, things like that.
right. So the real religious experience, or the one that he would probably recommend, would be the religion of the self, in a sense, like getting connected with you, your unconscious, your archetypes.
That's exactly right. And also with your dream world and your unconscious world. Jung had a
Right.
tremendous belief that there are beautiful dreams that can help to guide you, to reconnect you with those values and ideals and ideas that are larger than yourself. And once you find them, your life becomes filled with meaning, filled with connection. It's not necessarily easy. It may be challenging, but you'll know that you're living a life that's worthwhile. And our society has become extraordinarily skilled at helping to buffer you from the consequences of making choices that relate you in your life to things that are small and trivial. And it becomes very easy to lead a life of comfortable indulgence, distraction, entertainment, and psychic numbing. That kind of, as I discovered that, I began to answer the question that Professor Barry Farber asked me back in, or asked us back in 1990, is, what are people coming to us for? And I think they're coming to figure out what is their larger value and how do they relate to it.
Yeah, that's almost like an existential crisis, which I think
Exactly.
I think is more about not what's the meaning of existence, but what's my existence?
Yes,
Who am I to exist?
I
What's
think
my identity here? And once
I
you
think
figure
that's
that out,
correct.
to take it back to the CBT where you started out with, the negative thoughts, it pretty much takes care of itself.
I think that's correct. Mark, are you still there?
Yep.
Oh, good. Okay. Yes, she did need to go out. All is okay.
Okay, good.
Okay. Where were we? How are we doing?
We're doing good. Well, I think you just taking your dog out is a great example of what we're talking about, like that kind of connection. Even that, I was watching this Vietnam War documentary, the Ken Burns one that came out a couple years ago,
Hmm.
and one of those Vietnam vets who went through this terrible PTSD. One of the things that saved his life was, well, I can't kill myself. because I got
Hmm.
to take care of my dog. I mean, that's in a way like being part of something bigger than yourself, or at least bigger than how you see yourself at that moment.
I think that's true. Relating a relation to the instinctual, a connection with another being, a responsibility toward another is very helpful, as well as the fact that I think we're getting more and more evidence that for a lot of people who come to therapy, whether it's the client or the therapist or both, having a dog to whom you can relate actually helps. The just that connection really stimulates a lot of the physical responses that help to self-regulate.
Yeah, definitely. All right. So what we're dealing with here is somebody coming into the clinic, and this is something that I hear a lot whenever I meet somebody who's in therapy, or friends or family. I always ask them what's going on, and it seems to be the same response. Well, they don't put it in these exact words, but they're looking for something more.
Hmm.
Like they're looking
Hmm.
for something deeper, I think. Like just change the negative thoughts. They get some idea like that's not really the answer. And I think a lot of people are looking for this. And I think people get down on themselves because when they do go to therapy to change and it doesn't really happen, they think they must be at fault. And really, they're not. And what we need to do is explicate this relationship with their unconscious. And then once we get that in order, it's gonna the change is gonna take care of itself. I think people get frustrated because of that. It's like the unknown unknown, right? They don't know what's not there, and also they don't know that they don't know.
I think that's really true. And I think that, one of the things that's really interested or troubled me is how little I knew about philosophy and how I went through three Ivy League programs and got a doctorate in psychology, having no idea what the philosophical greats had said. And the irony is, I got
Mm,
PhD, a doctorate in philosophy, and I
yeah,
didn't know Hegel from Kant from Marcus Aurelius,
yeah.
and a few years ago, I began reading about philosophy, and I realized that it's a tragedy that the discipline of psychology and the discipline of philosophy don't talk to each other more.
Oh yeah.
And I like to go back to the idea that psychology means the study of the soul. And of course, philosophy is the study of wisdom. And how can you study the soul without trying to understand wisdom? So these clients that you talk about who
Hmm.
come to see a therapist and feel a little better, but feel that there is this unknown unknown, to me it comes from the ways in which our psychological field has failed to address the questions of philosophy. And philosophy basically is asking the questions of what does it mean to live a meaningful life? What is wisdom? How do you go about your life in a way that makes you feel good about it? And when we as psychological practitioners fail to address those questions, people end up with this vague sense of dissatisfaction. And I think Jung was the really the pioneer and still the best scientist, psychologist, philosopher, theologian to try to integrate those three domains of human knowledge in one treatment. And that's really why I consider myself a Jungian analyst.
Yeah, we're all influenced by some philosophy. I get in
Yes, we
arguments
are.
with CBT guys about this, and they said, "No, it's not about philosophy. It's just about doing what's correct." It's like, no, you're still influenced by Stoicism. Stoicism influenced CBT.
That's
It
right.
did. I mean, are you not aware of it? Well, you need to be aware of it. And also, knowing that Stoicism influenced CBT, go look at how Stoicism was developed and why. And
Hmm.
let's strength test those principles behind Stoicism because that's going to inform how we apply CBT.
I
But there's
think
just
that's
no, I
right.
mean, yeah, I mean, Jung gets laughed at, geez, but what about philosophy in general? I mean, that gets laughed at. But I think I totally agree. Psychology is a philosophy before anything else. Now, can we test it with scientific principles? Of course.
Hmm.
But at its root, it is a philosophy, and we got to get really good at thinking before we get good at Likert scales.
I think that's true. I also, one of my favorite quotes, and this is what ended my career as a psychology professor, Irvin Yalom said that the degree of precision with which we can measure any psychological phenomenon is inversely related to its importance. Now, of course,
Yeah, you're not going
of
to get a lot of grant money for that one.
no, you're not. And of course, he overstated it, and he played the game for years and got tenure before he let himself say that. But I do think that really captured it for me. That I spent a lot of years in my 30s doing studies and helping people to measure with great precision psychological phenomenon that I consider to be pretty trivial.
Yeah. Well, we brought up a lot here. One point that I may be kind of shoehorning it now, but the idea that by making religion psychological, I mean,
Hmm.
let me just tell you where I'm coming from. In my undergrad years, I did the whole, oh, religion's not rational, therefore we just need to do away with it. But I think what
Hmm.
Jung did that was so genius. I mean, I don't know if he did it himself. This is what Nietzsche was talking about before Jung. And I don't know, there
Hmm.
may have been somebody before Nietzsche, but when we make gods a projection of us, it actually
Hmm.
elevates the gods in importance. It
Hmm.
becomes more meaningful.
Hmm.
I mean, so like with Zeus or Hera, when we understand that these are projections of who we are, then it becomes even more meaningful. And I would say back even to the Old Testament Lord or God,
Hmm.
when we understand this could in fact be a projection of who we are, it becomes more meaningful to figure out what that relationship is and where it comes from. And I know Jung goes into this at length in volume 5, but
Yeah, I'm impressed with that idea. I think that makes sense. That we can see understanding religious imagery as projections, not as in any way a put down or a devaluing
yeah,
of the religious imaging, but exactly the opposite. We
right.
can see it as a projection of the very best parts of ourselves that can then become a North Star that can help us navigate our lives. It can become inspiration, and it can become uh, 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 emotional power for the journey. I think that's a good point.
Yeah, do you know about it was an interview that Jung did later in his life, and the interviewer asked Jung, the interviewee, whether he thinks God exists, and
Hmm.
God, I mean, there's a slip for you. And then Jung said famously, I don't think he exists, or I don't believe he exists, I know he exists.
Yes, yes.
And I was at a workshop, a Jungian workshop in the Jung Institute in New York a few months ago, and
Hmm.
I got into quite the scuffle with everybody else because people seem to think that that meant that God literally existed, like the Old Testament kind of God literally existed. And my thought was, no, I think what he meant was if you put enough people in a room, eventually they're going to come to the realization that they're going to develop their own God, their own
Hmm.
projection of a God, which of course doesn't diminish God's power in any way or his importance, but that's just who we are. And that's why he was able to say with such confidence, no, I know that God exists.
Yes,
You
this
want to
is the.
settle this for me?
Oh, I wish I could. I think that as with so many important religious philosophical writings and ideas, I like to consider them as food for thought. And my understanding of what Jung was saying was that no, the a very literal or concrete understanding of the Old Testament God, that I don't think that's what he was talking about. But I think he was talking about the idea of this mystery that can't be described, that can't be named, that is ineffable, ungraspable, incomprehensible, but nonetheless real. That there is some mystery in the universe that is beyond our understanding, that we can experience some relationship with, and that it's our task in life is to struggle with that. And people need to find what it is that is greater than themselves, to which they can commit themselves, even if that is only depersonalized values, such as the pursuit of truth, living out particular ideals, ideals of benevolence. Those kinds of things can also be a higher power. um, that's my read on it, but not everyone will agree with me. What I think is most important is that
Yeah.
people try to find a way that it is personally meaningful for each of them.
Okay. Sounds like you agree with me. I'm going to send this back to that Jung Institute. Just validate myself.
Well, I think as I hear what you're saying, I think that certainly is closer to my own understanding. I will say that.
Okay, well, it's more important to just hear your take on it. So what do you say to somebody who comes in the clinic and we're talking about just big ideas here, like your
Hmm.
relationship with yourself, your unconscious, your relationship, yeah, coming up with some sort of meaning, coming up with some sort of God projected or otherwise. And what do you say to somebody who comes into your clinic and says something to the effect of, "No, look, I just have this problem with my mother-in-law. I want to fix that. What are you talking about?"
Well, I think it's very important as a Jungian analyst or as any kind of a therapist who identifies with any theoretical orientation to really try to meet the client where he or she is. And
Hmm.
so I would not introduce any of these ideas until or unless I felt that they were appropriate. So if someone comes in with a simple relational issue, I'm dealing with whatever is right there. Again, back to Carl Rogers and person centered therapy.
Hmm.
When in doubt, a warm, empathic, and accurate reflection, you'll never go wrong with that. But if people start asking bigger questions, then I might start responding with bigger ideas. And the biggest ones start happening, interestingly, just as Jung predicted, in the 40s and 50s. I do a lot of work with clients in midlife, and their questions are sort of things like, "Is that all there is? What do I do with the time I have left? Have I made a mistake in with my career, with my marriage?" And that's where these larger understandings of big values, of archetypal values, of archetypal dimensions, that's where they can start to have an impact. But if you've got someone who has a very simple question and just wants to resolve it in 3, 6, 12, 15 sessions, I'm happy to do that work if it's indicated.
Yeah, it sounds like if somebody comes in and they don't want, these high-minded and high-order ideals of how psychotherapy is supposed to be, even just creating a relationship with them. I mean, it's in a way, it's like tricking them into having a better relationship with their mother-in-law on a more fundamental level, but creating a better connection with them. Getting them to the place where they could be more honest, probably more honest than they've ever been with anybody else in their entire life. That
Hmm.
is indirectly going to make the relationship with the mother-in-law better.
I think there's some truth to that. I think that I'm thinking of what one of my mentors told me about therapy and analysis, which is that people are really coming to you looking for an authentic relationship. They don't know that. They think they're coming for the solution to a particular problem, but I do a lot of long-term therapy, and I'm very honored by the clients who come to work with me and they stay over a long period of time. And we become the people who provide our clients with a place of comfort and safety, reflection, visibility. I hope some inspiration, certainly some accountability. And it's hard to describe the entire possibility of what the relationship might be early on. I also want to mention another one of we have a great Jungian community here in San Francisco. There's a wonderful book by Barbara Stevens Sullivan. It's called Psychotherapy Grounded in the Feminine Principle. And Barbara's a very good teacher. And one of the things she writes in her book that I just loved is she said, "There's a lot of failure in this work." And then she goes on to talk about, the kinds of ways in which she has failed and the ways in which other people have failed. And it really, really helped me because all through my graduate education and through all the ongoing education and the books that you've read, very few people present their failures. And I've had my share. And it doesn't always work. I think the clients mostly give it their best. I think we therapists always try to give it our best, but sometimes there's just not a connection. So there's a lot of regret and disappointment, I think, on both sides in the work. And I think it's worthwhile mentioning that as well.
Yeah, there's a lot of failure. There has been a lot of failure in this work for
Mm-hmm.
however long there have been humans. I mean, I would say this is the first profession. It wasn't that other one that most people say, it was shamanism.
Mm-hmm.
How do we
Mm-hmm.
create a connection with some sort of spiritual world? Now, the
Mm-hmm.
first example I use, I don't know if this is really the first example, but it goes back a long ways, and that is playing a bone flute to a storm god to
Mm-hmm.
appease it so it doesn't wipe out your tribe in, what present day Germany,
Mm-hmm.
40,000 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
So there's always been a lot of failure, but it's the most I mean, I'm not going to say important, but probably the most fundamental work that a human will ever do. And
Mm-hmm.
also it's the most tenuous. That's why we use that word spirit, which
Mm-hmm.
means breath, right? Which means like it's just this thing that you can sort of see and you can see it happen, but you can't really put it in a box. You can't really control it. We try to do that through CBT. It doesn't really work. It leaves people feeling unfulfilled. If you just do that work, again, not to disabuse CBT, just to put it in a certain context. So we're dealing with something tricky,
Mm-hmm.
but it's important. And I think maybe right now in present day America, I don't know. I don't really believe that we're going through any particularly difficult time. Like I said, I was just watching that Ken Burns Vietnam documentary. I mean, I was not alive during that time, but it just seemed way worse than what we were dealing with now. I mean, not even close.
We've been through difficult times before. I was a boy during Vietnam and remember very clearly the feelings of fear and disorientation. And I think if you read history, if you read the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, or you read um, uh, Plato and the Republic, and understand what happened to Aristotle, the attempts to develop a good self-government have been very problematic with deadly consequences for misjudgment, for thousands of years. So we're lucky to have had as much relative stability as we have.
Yeah. And as civilization is getting better, psychology is getting better. How we relate with ourselves is getting better. And I think those two things aren't mutually exclusive. How one is a reflection of the other. And I know it may seem like a lot of work to come into therapy and talk about meaning or God and these
Hmm.
big important questions, but I don't know how much energy are we putting on Twitter fights, right?
Well, I think probably too much, and this is why if we had more more therapy groups, or more groups where people could get to meet each other and talk about these things and understand our shared humanity, there would be fewer of these disconnected negative projections. Jung
Right.
is also famous for saying that one of the most important things that we can do to make the world a better place is to withdraw our negative projections from other people, and to do our own work on our own shadows. And again
Right.
and again and again, I have learned in my life that one of the most seductive mistakes we can make is to get drawn into self righteous anger.
Right.
I think one of my greatest regrets, both personally and professionally, is when I feel someone has wronged me and I become angry and act out of that anger. I've never awakened the next day and said, "Boy, I was glad to be angry. I wish I'd been more angry." I've always come back and said, "Wow, I wish I could have been kinder, more balanced." And it's hard sometimes. I've needed to set a limit, as we all have, but that is one regret I have, and I think that really reflects Jung's idea that we all have shadows, we all have these parts of ourselves that we're not proud of, and when we act from that shadow, or when we unconsciously project onto someone else, we end up creating alienation and a lot of pain. And I think that's one of the greatest contributions Jung had, was to get us to really was to urge us to work on our negative shadow projections.
Yeah. Well, that's a great thought to end on. Take all
Good.
the energy that you place on other people, all the ways that you criticize other people, and just turn that lens maybe in on yourself and go, how is this just a reflection of who I am?
I think I agree with you. I think that is something we all can do.
Yeah. All right, Dr. Hecht, thank you for joining me. Is there any way that we could reach you? I mean, I'm going to put all your links up in the description when I post this, but is there anything
Sure.
you want to say, particularly to self-promote you? That's what this is ultimately about.
Well, thank you very much for this. My email is justinhecht, Hecht @gmail.com. Happy to hear from anybody who has, found the ideas uh, in this podcast interesting. I'm really, really busy, so not all that interested in promoting myself, except to say that I really do enjoy public speaking and have heard that I'm pretty good at it. So I'm happy to talk to people about Jung and his ideas and why they still matter and how I try to apply them in today's world. So if anyone's interested in contacting me about that, I'd be happy to hear from you.
Yeah, we need more Jungians like you. I think Jung's ideas suffer from Jungians more than anything else. Maybe more introverted, I guess I could say in air quotes, guys who just hold themselves up and get self-satisfaction from these ideas, which is good. That needs to be part of it, but communication, reaching out, connecting, like you say, meeting people where they are, and I think Jung's ideas would have a better foothold for generations to come.
Well, I'll be happy to do whatever I can to help with that. And Mark, what a pleasure to speak with you. I've really enjoyed it.
Yeah, you too, Dr. Hecht, and thank you. And again, I appreciate your time.
Okay. Thanks a lot and hope to be in touch again. 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 Hope to be